In 1946, Britain emerged from World War II victorious and exhausted. Its national debt was around 250% of GDP, more than 2.5 times the value of everything its economy produced in a year. By almost any conventional measure, the country should have spent the next decade just trying to survive. Instead, it built the NHS, launched the welfare state, and began 4 decades of economic growth. The debt didn't stop any of it, which raises a question almost nobody asks. What if debt at the level of nations doesn't work the way we think it does? Let's start with the raw numbers, because the numbers themselves are the puzzle. Japan's debt to GDP ratio sits above 260%. That means the government owes more than 2.5 times the value of everything every Japanese person produces in an entire year. Every car, every piece of electronics, every salary paid, every meal served, add it all up, and Japan's debt is still bigger by a lot, and Japan has been at these levels for decades, not months. The United States owes around $35 trillion. That figure is so large it stops feeling real. If you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you roughly 96,000 years to spend it. The UK's debt to GDP ratio is over 100%. France, Italy, Canada, all carrying debt loads that would make any personal finance advisor faint on the spot. Now flip to the other end of the list, countries with the lowest debt ratios. You find places like Brunei, some oil-rich Gulf states, a handful of small economies that run on commodity wealth, and you find many of the world's poorest, most economically fragile nations, carrying almost no government debt at all. Not because they're disciplined, because nobody will lend to them. The pattern is exactly backwards from what you'd expect. The richer the country, the more it owes. The more chaotic the economy, the cleaner the balance sheet. Not out of virtue, but out of exclusion. The countries that can't borrow aren't debt-free because they're careful. They're debt-free because nobody trusts them enough to hand over the money. Now here's where everything you think you know stops applying. When you borrow money, from a bank, a credit card, a friend, the relationship is simple. Someone else has the money. You take it, you owe it back. If you can't pay, you're in trouble. The money always belonged to someone else, and one day it has to go back. When a government borrows, something structurally different happens. A government issues bonds. It essentially posts a public notice to the world. Give us money now and we'll pay you back later with interest. And investors, banks, pension funds, foreign governments, everyday people choose to buy them voluntarily in enormous quantities. Nobody is forced. No one is coerced. They queue up. The key word is choose. Nobody makes the world buy American government bonds. Nobody forces Japanese pension funds to hold Japanese government debt. They do it because they want to, because those bonds represent something they value more than cash sitting idle. But the bigger difference, the one that explains almost everything, is this. Most rich countries borrow in their own currency. This is not a small detail. This is almost the entire game. Argentina learned it the brutal way. In the late 1990s, Argentina borrowed heavily in US dollars, a currency they had no control over. When the economy faltered, when they needed more dollars than they could generate, there was no lever to pull. They defaulted. The peso collapsed. Bank accounts were frozen. Middle-class families lost their savings overnight. The crisis was so catastrophic, it's still studied as a textbook case in exactly what can go wrong. Now compare that to Japan. Japan's debt is yen-denominated. Japan's own central bank holds a significant chunk of it. Japan has been running debt ratios that would destroy most economies for 30 consecutive years, while its interest rates have barely moved off the floor. Not because Japan is lucky, because the debt is in a currency Japan controls. Your debt is a weight. You carry it until it's gone. A government's debt issued in its own currency is closer to a dial. So if rich countries are borrowing in their own currencies, and investors are choosing to buy that debt voluntarily, the next question is obvious. Why? Why would anyone look at Japan, a country owing 2.5 times its annual economic output, and think, yes, I want to lend these people more money? The answer is trust, but not trust the way you normally mean it. When investors buy a government bond, they're not just lending money, they're buying certainty, a guaranteed return in a world full of uncertainty. And the countries that can offer that most convincingly, the ones with stable governments, reliable legal systems, predictable economies, become something the financial world has a specific name for: safe havens. In a crisis, money doesn't run away from debt, it runs toward it, toward American treasury bonds, toward Japanese government bonds, toward British gilts. When markets panic, when banks wobble, when some corner of the global economy catches fire, investors sell the risky stuff and buy the debt of the countries they trust most. The demand for for that debt goes up precisely when everything else looks dangerous. This is the inversion almost nobody explains clearly. The countries carrying the most debt are the ones the world treats as the safest place to put money, not despite the debt, alongside it. The debt exists because the trust exists, and the trust exists because of everything underneath the debt: the institutions, the history, the economic complexity that makes these countries reliable over decades and centuries. There's a number that makes this concrete. The interest rate a country pays on its debt, its borrowing cost, is essentially the world's live verdict on how much it trusts that country. The United States currently borrows at relatively low rates. Japan borrows at rates so low they've been near zero for years. These are not the rates of countries in trouble. They're the rates of countries the world is comfortable lending to at almost no return, just for the security of knowing they'll be paid back. Greece in 2010 tells the other side of that story. At the peak of its debt crisis, Greece was paying interest rates above 30% on some of its bonds. Not because it owed more than Japan, it didn't, but because the world had stopped trusting it. The interest rate is the fear, and for the richest countries that fear is almost zero. Debt without trust costs you everything. Debt built on trust costs you almost nothing. But there's still a question sitting unanswered. Why borrow at all? If these countries are wealthy, why not just spend what they have? This is where the obvious assumption needs to go. The instinct is to think of government debt the way you think of personal debt, something that happens when you run out of money, an emergency measure, a sign of overspending. But for most rich governments, debt isn't a consequence of running out. It's a tool they reach for deliberately. And the logic behind it is the same logic a business uses when it takes out a loan to buy equipment it couldn't otherwise afford. In 2008, when the global financial system came close to collapse, governments didn't tighten their belts. They borrowed and spent massively. The United States passed a $787 billion stimulus package. The UK nationalised banks. Across the developed world, governments took on enormous new debt, not because they were panicking, but because they understood something about how economies work in a downturn. When private spending collapses, when businesses stop investing and households stop spending, an economy can fall into a spiral. Less spending means less income means less spending. Governments can interrupt that spiral by stepping in as the spender of last resort, borrowing to build roads, pay salaries, fund hospitals, keeping money moving when the private sector freezes. The economist John Maynard Keynes described this logic in the 1930s, watching governments make the mistake of cutting spending during the Great Depression and making things dramatically worse. His argument, that governments should borrow and spend during downturns, then pay it down during booms, became the intellectual backbone of how most rich countries manage their economies today. Though the paying it down during booms part, it should be said, has proven considerably harder in practice. Because here's the political reality underneath the economics. Borrowing is easy to vote for. Tax rises and spending cuts are not. Every government that has ever promised to reduce the debt has discovered that the moment the economy looks healthy, the pressure to borrow for something new, a new program, a new crisis, a new priority, becomes almost impossible to resist. The debt doesn't just grow because of bad times, it grows because in good times, the urgency to shrink it evaporates. Debt is a tool that is very easy to pick up and very hard to put down. So if rich countries can borrow in their own currency, and the world trusts them, and debt is a legitimate tool, does any of this ever go wrong? Is there a limit? Or can a wealthy government just borrow forever? The honest answer is, nobody knows exactly where the line is, but history is clear that a line exists. In 2022, the UK government announced a package of unfunded tax cuts with no clear plan for how to pay for them. The bond market reacted within hours. Interest rates spiked. The pound fell. Pension funds came close to collapse. The policy was reversed within weeks. No invasion, no pandemic, no banking crisis, just the bond market deciding it didn't quite trust the plan. That was enough. Confidence is not a fixed quantity. It's a daily referendum held by millions of investors, each one deciding whether to keep holding a government's debt or quietly move their money somewhere else. When the answer starts shifting, governments feel it almost immediately. The constraint on government debt isn't a law, it isn't a number, it's a relationship.